if we could go back to what you mentioned in lunch about the academic hippie.
Oh, the
and
academic
just say
hippie.
more about that and what that's like for each one of those subpersonalities, if that's what it is.
That, it's interesting. I was mentioning that my first workshop was with Didi Firman in Pennsylvania, literally 38 years ago, and one of the first subpersonalities that came up in one of the, look at all your subpersonality exercises was something called Dr. Didi. And at that point, I didn't even have a BA, and I didn't much think about it ever again because it didn't show up as a prevalent subpersonality. But at a certain point, I realized that in fact that had been driving me or moving me, calling me for years because whatever it was. And 15 years later, I had my doctorate, and so. It was rather coincidental that I got into the field of academics. It's not something I ever anchored into or aimed to do it. Even getting my doctorate was because of a psychosynthesis. Jack Weideman, who studied with Tom Yeomans, was on the faculty at the University of Massachusetts in their doctoral program, and he said to me, why don't you come get a doctorate? And I said, okay. My basic a stance in life that is in part informed by psychosynthesis is kind of what shows up is something to pay attention to.
Right.
So the same thing happened with my professor job, which is that someone invited me to come do one class. Michael Gigante and I did a class together at Union on psychosynthesis, and coincidentally, right at that same weekend, someone on the faculty was leaving for reasons I don't know what that was about. And all the students, of course, loved psychosynthesis and went to the director of the program, said, this is great. And so then like a week later, he called me and said, you want a job? And I had to, put my CV together and jump through a few hoops, but not very many. And the academic hippie, part of my orientation and kind of the testing the waters of did I really want to play in academics was that I went to the job interview in my blue jeans.
How was it going to play?
Right. And so I had to find out if that was going to be okay. And it was, though I actually do have dress-up clothes and dress up more for my teaching. So what it means to me is again the balancing and synthesis of opposites. The part of me that is very free-form, au naturel, lives through as much authenticity as I can find in myself, which started out as a hippie, a nice movement to attach all of those qualities to. And then the academic who, has to be able to work in APA style and write academically and use some of my greatest gifts, which is the thinking function and my language, words and writing and talking feel very natural to me. So those two come together in that environment. And both the program itself, the faculty and the director, and the students really value my presence because I carry both. So the classes I teach are all often quite evocative. They're not, I'm not standing at a podium. There's not lectures. There's not statistics. It can be quite emotional experiences. And as I say, I bring in psychosynthesis to everything. Sometimes I'll teach just a class on guided imagery, or I'll do an introduction to psychosynthesis, or I'll often go through different psychological functions and teach a class. I teach one on impulse and desire. I don't call it that. I can't quite remember what I call it, but it has to do with what do you want and how do you work with your clients.
Right.
So the academic work I do is with people who are training to be counselors.
Yeah, that's very rich in possibilities.
Yep. I love the work, and it works for me.
And are there particular exercises that you like to use in your teaching?
At the academic level?
At the academic level?
Not so much. I will often do something, but even in my teaching in psychosynthesis training, I'm pretty extemporaneous in terms of what I do. I'll do some classic exercises by way of teaching. This is a classic exercise. Let's go up the mountain, see the wise being. But more often than not, the exercises I do to ground theory, whether it's in an academic setting or in a training setting, are, come in the moment or come out of years of experience. But new ones get invented every year just because it's one of the ways that psychosynthesis has stayed fresh for me. And someone once asked me, how come it takes you, so long to plan? You've done this for a million years. But I reinvent the wheel. The core theory, as we talked about earlier, stays the same, but how I teach it, the order I teach it in, it's one of the things I feel about Assergilli's work is it's like a hologram. You can start anywhere. You can start with presence or purpose. You can start with will. You can start with subpersonalities. It doesn't matter where you start. It'll all flow into itself. So that keeps it very alive for me to just not have an agenda or a preset syllabus of how I'm going to do it. And so my co-leaders, some are easier with my extemporaneous style than others.
And when you say co-leaders, do you mean people who are academic? Step in, or
that is also true, but in the academic world I mostly tend to teach alone. I work in a mentor. We have a mentoring model, and so I will work with another faculty person, but that's pretty easy. And teaching in the psychosynthesis training program is where I always have a co-leader. For me that feels essential to have somebody. This strong feeling in me came out of what went wrong in psychosynthesis in California. So I always want somebody who's watching me to see if I'm missing something, back to your earlier question of the unconscious, leading us, what we're unconscious of can lead us astray. And so that, having peer supervision as a therapist, having co-leaders and colleagues, all of those things seem like a sane and safe way to go about teaching or working.
So you're actually thinking of that as a mentoring model then?
Our teaching in this particular program, it is considered a mentor model in that it's a low residency program, and every student has 2 faculty people that they work with, and so they work with the content that they need to get the license, but instead of being, in one person's class for 6 months and another person's class for 6 months, they have 2 faculty people who see them through the whole program. So it's technically considered a mentor model.
So what does low residency mean?
In this particular academic program, students are there 10 days a year, either 5 2-day weekends or 2 5-day encounters.
That's all they need to be present, and otherwise they're receiving teachings online?
They're mostly there's some online stuff, but most of it is that they have a template of what they do. They're reading, they're writing. In a program like this, as opposed to having tests, which you might have in a school where you're going 5 days a week, they're writing a lot. So they're writing critical annotations of the books they read, they're writing scholarly papers, they're writing a thesis, and they're doing, of course, because it's a counselor training program, they're doing an internship out in the real world, wherever they can find them. Because we work with people from all 50 states and out of the country, so. And
this is Union College you're describing?
Union Institute and University is its official name.
A
little cumbersome.
Well, it certainly describes their aspirations, at least.
Yes, yes, and it's been quite a gift to take psychosynthesis into academia. I think it's just, again, as I mentioned before, John and Ann's books are a big leap into being more in the field and not seen as complementary, or worse yet, as flaky. But having a number of people teaching in academic settings is another way that's just incredibly important. So I'd like to see more and more of that over time.
And how would you see that moving through the evidence-based call from the National Psychological Association?
Again, having been in the field for so long, I see things rise and fall. You know, CBT right now is like the big thing. Everybody's like, "Oh, CBT," but it's changed over all the years I've been there.
Right.
I've watched everything rise and fall. So I think this evidence-based practice I think it's fair. It's important that just because somebody likes something doesn't mean it's useful. But it's also equally true, like any polarity, that just because somebody can do a test to prove its efficacy doesn't mean it is efficacious or is so for everyone. So we need more research in psychosynthesis. We need more print in standard journals. People like Michael Brown, who's down in Richmond, he does a lot of publishing in counseling journals about psychosynthesis. That kind of stuff is really important, just so it becomes more and more available in the field.
Right, right. Are you yourself involved in research, any standard research?
No, not interested in the least. Though I do write the academic stuff. I have something coming out on a peer-reviewed journal, on online journal for the American Counseling Association on psychosynthesis, very specifically. So I try to get it out there that way, but yeah, no research for me. I think I would be wanting what I actually understand as common wisdom to be kind of validated, which is how does a life that is deeply connected to a sense of meaning, purpose, and values, how does that create a better quality of life? And not only does it create a better quality of life, does it create a better citizen, a better global citizen? So that would be, for me, what would be important would be not to look at the specific techniques of psychosynthesis, or is psychosynthesis as a theory as effective as Rogerian work, or does it work for this population or that population? But the most broad stroke and the most important aspect of, I think, what psychosynthesis invites is a deep sense of meaning, purpose, and values in an individual life, a response to the call of self. And so I would like to know, if people are asking themselves that question, if people are listening to the call of self, if people have an internal unifying center, Assagioli's word, that they actually anchor into, as opposed to what most of the world, I believe, it primarily anchors into, which is external unifying centers. Does that make us better human beings, both internally and as people in the world?
Right. And going back to your talking earlier about moving beyond good and bad and the hierarchy there, Ken Wilber has really done a lot of work with establishing how it's not making something better or more valuable, it's just more fundamental, I think. Is that the kind of question when you're saying better? Is that what you're meaning? I'm
not sure what you're referring to in Ken Wilber's work. I use a lot of Ken Wilber, though he also has a pretty hierarchical version of reality, so some of it I don't use. But the better, worse thing is the duality that creates objectification. Now, I have to be able to answer for myself. Is it better for me to have green tea or a beer right now? And the better then is a reference back into an internal unifying center and into the way I know myself through my psychological functions. So I'm not proposing a value-free experience. What I'm proposing is a way of knowing one's values that are based on the deepest internal unifying center, based on the call of self that we learn over time to hear or feel or intuit more and more clearly, so that I need, I'm not going to be a happy person if I'm just living to pay the bills.
Right.
And the world is full of not happy people. Now, I may be somebody who is working a job I hate, but because I'm feeding my children,
that helps
I'm connected to my purpose, meaning, and values. So that's the piece that I think is key in getting beyond duality. You can have, the language, and everyone says it in the spiritual traditions. In Zen, they say it's like a finger pointing to the moon because, heck, we can't really tell you what it is. We have no words to describe this.
Right.
And that's why we have haiku, so that over and over again for thousands of years, people try to tell what it is in 17 syllables. The bottom line is that experience that I know for me, and I can access that. We call it in psychosynthesis purpose, or purpose, meaning, and values is one of my little catchphrases. We call it the self, the call of self. But the real work is getting out of our own way, or deconditioning, getting rid of the things that pull us out of knowing what's true for us.
Right.
And we see it, in very young children, how quickly they stop knowing what they want, think, feel. So I can't even quite remember where that question started, but in the sense of duality, I think one of the things I was thinking of was we can, in a tradition like Zen, the concept of enlightenment can be both an invitation to the largest possible conception of the universe or experience of the universe, but it can also just be another duality. There's some place to be and I'm not there.
Right.
I'm here and that's over there and I should get over there.
Right.
So for me, the issue of softening duality is the issue. It really is a social justice issue, and it is really a spiritual transpersonal issue. It's the issue of not objectifying ourselves, not objectifying others, not viewing ourselves through a lens of gathering privilege and holding on to privilege, and not even viewing ourselves. And I think this is one thing I think Ken Wilber addresses is the possibility that in an evolutionary kind of way, human beings are maybe just beginning to be able to be thinking of themselves more as social beings than as individuals. And so then we go back again to Assagioli, who had said everything that needed to be said. He talks about the social will. The will to power, personal will, will to meaning, social will, universal will. So there's that movement where, and one of his 7 paths to self-realization is the heroic path. And that, I bring that up because at least part of the movement that some people already access and some maybe don't, is the possibility that what's best for us is not what's best for the world, and we could choose away from what's best for us. It's always kind of a lurking question. How much do you fight for your own rights?
Right.
How much do you fight to protect your kids as opposed to all kids? And I think that's part of an evolutionary movement where we wouldn't be quite so bound in safety. Yeah. Though there are distortions of equal weight on the other side of collectivism. We see in cultures that bias that way.
Right.
Balancing and synthesis of opposites.
So it makes me think of the theme of your upcoming conference, Transformation and the Synthesis of Opposites, or Polarities, and how you arrived at that.
I can't address that because I had nothing to do with this conference other to be the beneficent other who blessed those who volunteered. They did all of it. My lovely colleagues and friends who have been inspired by psychosynthesis.
Right. And the inspiration certainly is in that title.
Yes.
Right.
Yep. That addresses it at every level, from the inside of me to the whole world.
Mm-hmm. And it resonates when it comes from a place like that.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
And, you use the word resonate, and that for me, too, is a really important concept. We hear it in music, visually, in all the psychological functions, there's a resonance. There is a way of knowing what we want, to use that psychological function, what we feel, what we think. To me, resonance is, if one thinks about meditating, you get all the chakras
the whole
lined
body,
up,
right?
and you're just there. And that is one of the ways I think we know the call of self. It's not the soldier standing at attention, but it's that, as in martial arts and as in meditation, it's it's a relaxed but alert posture. And so for me, that's true in every psychological function, that there's a way to be on, if you will, to be accessing and knowing yourself as self by listening for those cues of resonance. And so that, for me, informs a lot of my teaching. And yeah.
So the resonance, which is a word that I resonate with for whatever reason, how do you relate that to purpose and the way that you explore purpose?
For me, it's the way we know purpose. That when I feel that vibration of resonance, I know I'm on. And the question I said I was going to answer was actually not a question, but just a story that I want to tell. Okay. Because it has to do with resonance, and because one of the things that most defines me as a teacher is that I have such access to my feelings. And so I thought to myself, what better way to teach what psychosynthesis means to me than to find out for myself in that moment how I could know how I could show live with you what that deep resonance is like. And so it could be a million stories, but the story that is with me most of late is the story of my niece who was right near the World Trade Center. She lived right around the corner when the towers went down. She could see it through her window. She ended up having leukemia as a young woman a couple of years after that, with some suspicion that a lot of people got illnesses from that. And then long treatment, and she's my niece, my brother's daughter, and she's pregnant and she's happy and healthy. And so why that's important for me, it's not just because there's going to be another kid and because I love this girl and because she's suffered, but because it's for me being able to know what is important to me, to feel. She recently came up to tell my 92-year-old parents that she was pregnant, and everybody's, la 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 la. But me, I'm just here. It's the human spirit. It's the human spirit moving through a world full of pain and suffering that brings me to tears, whether it's in the gloriousness of something that somebody's doing or in the suffering that they're experiencing. And so one of the things why I love the psychological function map, and it's fine if you edit out my crying. I believe that some of our work is to be fluent in every psychological function. When I feel most myself, I don't quite differentiate anymore thinking from feeling, from sensation, from impulse, from intuition, from imagination.
I was going to ask you.
It becomes one experience. And I think the more we do this work of knowing ourselves, knowing where we're wounded in psychological functions, the more we come to the table whole with all of us available. So that it shocks me how often people are horrified by tears, their own tears, other people's tears. They try to be strong, they try to be brave, especially, you guys, were you here at the conference in 2000 at the University of Massachusetts? That we did? I don't know I can't remember whether you were, but
I can't remember either.
I did one of the introductions, and it was right after, I believe it was Stephen Schatz's son had been in a car accident, and one of my colleagues had a baby who had been born with no breastbone. And I couldn't, for the life of me, not talk about that. And I just, that was maybe even earlier than 2000, but in the same way that I can't come in to teach psychosynthesis without talking about what's happening in Japan.
Right.
If it's not about what's true for me, if it's not about how I understand the world grok it, then it doesn't have resonance. And that permission that I give to clients and trainees and colleagues and friends, that I allow myself to have feelings, that I'm, my kids, my husband calls me Dr. Crybaby. Another one of those balancing and synthesis of opposites. I love it. I love that I cry. I welcome tears, and I welcome, and at the same time, I never feel, well, not never, but I rarely feel overwhelmed by my feelings, and I can always step outside of them when I need to. And the same thing is true for thinking and impulse and desire and all of those things. So again, that map and that call to self, call of self, I can remember standing up at that, actually this was not the one in 2000, this was way earlier because it wasn't where Molly was, but I can remember standing up and having a choice point, and this comes back to the act of will. I work a lot with the idea of the moment between trigger and action, that we have a choice point. Right. Where we can either go with where the trigger wants to take us, which is also personality reaction and old wounding, or where we can pull back to something more akin to self. And I find myself in that choice point more and more often, and really know I can tighten up and move towards a status quo that makes more sense in this context, whatever it is, or I can let down boundaries and go with whatever is true in me. And that's freedom. That ability to have the choice point is really freedom, and that's the stories of the Dalai Lama's physician in a Chinese prison for 20 years, never being bitter, never holding hostility towards his captors. Nura Nisa, Pir Vilayat Khan's sister, in held by the Nazis.
I don't know this story.
She, Pir Vilayat Khan, the head of the Sufi order, his sister in World War II volunteered to be in the underground and was in France and in the underground and was captured by the Nazis and tortured and killed. But her experience, as people understood it, was everything we're pointing to, which is, talk about your disidentification. Stepping back from the content, because in the end, the call of self is a call in which death is okay. So those moments of freedom where even the things we cling to, the locked door to protect our stuff. I have a blog on Psychology Today on their website, and the last blog post I did was called Defenseless. And it was about that invitation to not hold oneself behind locked doors, to be willing to know what we feel, that the best defense is not a good offense, but is vulnerability. And it's actually generated a few responses, people whose buttons got pushed a little.
Right. And maybe did also generate the response that was posted on YouTube, I think. It was on YouTube with the woman who was talking about vulnerability as that whole topic. Yes. She did, and I won't remember her name. I recommended her as a keynote speaker for the conference. She did a powerful, powerful piece on vulnerability. Yep. So, could you say more about how death is okay?
It better be, or we're in trouble.
Right. But your understanding of it seems like it's coming from a pretty clear point.
Again, I go back to Freud a little bit, and his kind of elucidation of the concept of the ego, and the function of the ego to mediate between the outside world and the inner world. And that all makes sense to me. And the bottom line of that function, as best I understand how he was conceiving of it or how it's used popularly, is, it is to keep us safe. And to keep us safe, bottom line, means to keep us not dead.
To keep us alive.
Yeah. And the price we pay for that is often, it's not worth the outcome as far as I'm concerned. To live simply to stay alive, you make smaller and smaller worlds for yourself. To live to protect your things, you make smaller and smaller worlds for yourself. So, since we know we're all going to die, I mean, it's the one thing most of us know. There's a way that to accept that inevitability is actually quite freeing.
I agree with that. And what is it in psychosynthesis that teaches that without teaching it in those words?
I think the whole concept of the transpersonal dimension, I think that the whole idea of the call of self, once we start talking about self, whether it's higher self or personal self, what we start talking about, especially in the language of psychosynthesis, we start talking about higher self, is we start talking about an experience of unity. And if there's an experience of unity, then matter's not created or destroyed. Or my favorite joke, what did the Zen master say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. Once we start to think that way, then, and there's a natural process too, because as our bodies age, as we know,
let go.
yes, we do start to let go. It is a very natural process. And even if you've ever watched an animal die, or if you've been with a person when they've died, sometimes it's a big uproar, but if somebody's not in a lot of pain, physical pain, it tends to be a pretty peaceful, I think. I've watched more animals than people, but a pretty peaceful transition.
Right.
So I think we teach that in psychosynthesis by the process of identification, disidentification, and self-identification. And when we think of self as that which is beyond the body, the who we are that is not bound even by a lifetime, by a body, by a story. We start in our work with it by disidentifying from the content of our childhood trauma. I have this wounded part of me and I am not this wounded part of me. But ultimately that same process is I have this body and I am not this body. Or I have this body and I am more than this body, depending on the way you do that disidentification exercise. And then if we say that, that's the classic psychosynthesis exercise. I have a body, and I am not my body. So there's the invitation into death is okay.
And maybe it'll be easier when we are in that position that it's inevitable also.
I don't know.
When we don't have a choice, it's a natural next step.
Yes, and I think then I see my mother, who's 92, who's completely placidly prepared, and sometimes a little anxious to get on with it. Yeah. And then we know over and over again the people who, on a heroic path, have no hesitation to sacrifice their lives for somebody else. The ego is not that strong. A lot of the work is having, and I think it was Ken Wilber who said this specific phrase, that the work is to have ego in service of self, not vice versa. And when that's true, and then the call of self is heroic, then it doesn't matter that the ego is saying, but wait, if you jump in the water to save those people who are drowning, you're going to drown yourself. It doesn't matter, because the call of self isn't interested in life over death. It's interested in responding to itself. Must save those people.
Right.
And there are heroes all the time. It's one of the things that, one of the many things that makes me sad in our culture is how little our young men and women who, for all sorts of socioeconomic reasons that are bad news in this culture, but those who step up to become soldiers, many of them are, deeply trying to follow a heroic path.
Right.
It is the call of self. And it rarely gets recognized as such, and then they get treated so terribly. But some people live and die on those battlefields in response to the call of self, and good for them.
And I was just being aware of wishing that I could follow you more in regard to this paper that you're referencing of the different paths.
Martha gave me the article, but I don't remember anybody ever training me in it. So it's like maybe 4 pages long. He is very clear that no one is ever purely on one path. And at different points in your life, people may, move from one path to another. And I've certainly experienced that. And one of the analogies that I've made to it is the Native American medicine wheel, where the assumption is, in fact, and I don't know very much about it, but that you come in with some strengths, but your task in a lifetime is to traverse the whole wheel. I feel that way about the psychological functions. I feel that way about these paths.
Oh, interesting.
That it is our, it is our task to know our strengths and go with our strengths, but also to build our weaknesses.
Right.
And it was Jung who said, and this goes back to the psychological function map, it was Jung who said, you get to spirit through the inferior function. And I certainly find that that's true in working with clients. The dominant function is where all the defenses got built. And so for the thinker sitting in my office, I have to ally myself with her thinking function in order for her to feel safe.
Right.
But we're not going to break through the veil of her defenses in her thinking function.
It'll be her feeling.
It'll be her feeling function, or maybe imagination, or maybe sensation. It'll be a function that she's not very familiar with, because that's undefended. That's still more vulnerable.
Oh, I love hearing that. It's so interesting. It makes a lot of sense intuitively. Well, I think I want to give you the opportunity to say anything that seems important for you to say about psychosynthesis and the whole field of psychosynthesis. Since we're in a real change process now, I think it seems to me to be a global kind of change period. But certainly I know it is in psychosynthesis.
I think two things are happening. I think psychosynthesis is continuing to gain a foothold in the field of psychology with the name psychosynthesis. And so it is becoming more something that people know and will be somewhere in the academy as a theory of psychology, like Rogerian, Jungian, psychoanalysis. And I also think that some of the most important and core principles in psychosynthesis are leaching into a variety of other fields, not only a variety of other psychological theories, but also a variety of other fields, in such a way that those seeds will grow, and they will grow with different words, and they will grow without any reference to psychosynthesis, but they will grow. And truth be told, I don't think Aspergilli would care if the term psychosynthesis faded. I don't particularly. While it's here, I want to name psychosynthesis for what it is, and I want to have its body of work be represented for what it is. But I suspect, like everything else, it will transform, and it may or may not keep that name, and it may simply be like those, Johnny Appleseed. The seeds get planted and they grow all over.
I love the term leaching. Yeah. Spreading, disseminating that way.
So I love it. I love psychosynthesis. Still do. Vincent's earlier question about what does it mean for me to redecide from time to time. One of the exercises that I also do with my trainees, and I got from Martha Grampton, a veritable treasure trove of training for me, even just in, she gave me and any of us who are interested permission just to go through her files where she had all her exercises and poke around, is a values clarification exercise. And for me, again, in the light of the idea of purpose, meaning, and values clarification is a really important piece of work that everyone needs to do, because most people, when they do any values clarification exercise, they will find out that these are their values like that, highest to lowest. Then you take those values and you look at what your week looks like, how you've spent your time in a given week, and what most people are going to find is that their lowest values are taking up the most time and their highest values are taking up the least time. That's the in-breath and out-breath awareness and will. So I do quite often do a values clarification exercise and check in with myself. What's really important to me now?
Right.
Because I don't assume it should be the same things or that it is the same things that it was a few years ago. I had an experience once many years ago in my early psychosynthesis training. they were still saying, wise old being. They weren't saying wise old man. I got in, right after that. But wise old being. And so my image, being a dyed-in-the-wool feminist, was, of course, it was going to be a woman, no doubt about that, and it was a wise old woman. And that was kind of the character that I dialogued with for a long time. And sometime in my training, years later, or in some workshop, there was another one of those exercises, and the image that came up was a man. And my first reaction was like, get the heck out of here. I don't do men as figures of wisdom. And the character said to me, well, that's okay, but I thought you might be tired of working with your mother. And I said, okay. And but what was more important about that than anything was it was in that moment that I really got none of this was stagnant. There was not a God, a wise old being.
Right.
There was not a truth that I was going to be able to stick with. And at that point I was very young. I was in my 20s. And I wanted simple truths. I wanted textbooks and answers.
Right.
So that moment was very much a forced disidentification that had ripple effects throughout my whole understanding of psychosynthesis and life, which is that I have to check back in and find out what's wise now.
True now.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's what I do. I do values clarification exercises, and I think about it, and I talk to Ted, and I ask the question. And I also, I mentioned this earlier, I respond a lot to kind of what's on my plate. So if something comes towards me, I pretty much respond to it. When Insight Meditation Society called me and said, will you come do consulting with us? I said yes without thinking about it because they asked.
Right.
And things that come my way, almost anything that comes my way, I say yes to. I've learned over some years to not say yes to everything, and if it's a big something, to work my way through it. And so sometimes I also say no to big things. But it's worked very well for me to see what comes towards me. And that's one of the reasons I'm still doing psychosynthesis training, because people are still coming.
Because it's still alive.
Right. And, if there's a year when I don't have applicants for the training program, that will be information for me. But so far, knock on wood, if you build it, they will come.
I'm interested to hear just a little bit, if it doesn't take us off track, whatever that means, about your work with Insight Meditation and your consultation role there.
One of the changes that has happened, and I did the same thing with the Sufi community, I did some work with them in the early days too. One of the things that was changing in meditation practices, whether it was Sufism or mindfulness practice or Zen, probably 25 years ago, was those spiritual practices that thought that they could handle people's psychological wounding through the methodology of their meditation really got that they couldn't. So that's where there was for me, a lot of interface between my psychosynthesis and spiritual traditions and people who are spiritual practitioners, because psychosynthesis could hold. It's not like sending somebody who's a long-term meditator into Freudian analysis, where there's just gonna cut off the other half of who they are. So people could come, or systems could come and say, how do we bring the psychological part into the spiritual part without it being that pre-trans fallacy? Either it's either it's pre-personal or transpersonal. And I still work a lot with people who are meditators. And it is one of the appeals for people of psychosynthesis is that their spiritual world is respected and used and
even recognized.
Yes, recognized and feels like the two feed each other.
You had mentioned also over lunch break, now let me try to capture this. You had mentioned I don't know if it was frustration you felt or how you didn't like it, where Saggioli said something about
take you to the
door
of the great mystery.
Right, of the great mystery, right. But not through it.
Right. So in the book Psychosynthesis, and maybe on page 28,
early on,
right. He has that line, psychosynthesis will take you to the doors of the great mystery, but it will not get you through.
Right.
So as this youngster coming into psychosynthesis, I wanted to go through those doors, and I wanted psychosynthesis to be the way through the doors of the great mystery. So that was hard for me. I didn't believe it. That was one of the things that I just didn't pay attention to, didn't believe early on. And as I have aged and wisened up, I realize that it's really true, and it is part and parcel of his very conscious and appropriately conscious choice to anchor psychosynthesis as a psychology in the field of psychology. He doesn't anchor it as a spiritual practice. He doesn't have any religious overtones. As a result of that, I work with people of every religion. I've had priests and rabbis in my training program, Muslims. We know, because psychosynthesis is a psychology and not a spiritual tradition or a religion, that anybody can be there. And he, I can only assume, probably had a lot more insight into spiritual practices that could be useful. But that wasn't the job. The job was to do the psychological piece of the work and let individuals find their own spiritual practice that might, in theory, take them through the doors of the great mystery. So for me, that's just plain, now it just feels like common sense. I wouldn't want to mix those two.
And you found that to be true for yourself.
I found that I don't know what will take me through the doors of the great mystery. I'm not even sure what that looks like. Yes, death to me feels probably like the most of it, though I think from time to time we peer through the doors of the great mystery. But again, we talked about this a little bit in terms of, for me, it's never about an outcome. There's not enlightenment. There's peak experiences, there's clearer, there's more I, is one of the ways I sometimes refer to it. More I available in this moment rather than less I available, more self rather than less self. But not, I can remember working once in a workshop with somebody I was doing subpersonality work, and somebody took me aside in the break and said, and it was at a Sufi community, and said, but I don't have any subpersonalities. I'm beyond that. And that's the thing that I think a lot of people got set up for, is that there is a movement to a beyond that.
Right.
And I don't believe that that's true. We're, as long as we're embodied, we got subpersonalities, we've got preferences. The great way is easy for those with no preferences. The great way is easy for nobody, because there's not anybody who doesn't have preferences. But it's how tightly we hold to the subpersonalities, to the scripts, to the preferences. That's the difference between what kind of quality of life we have.
Right. And that's interesting to hear you describe that way, because my understanding of the word beyond has had to do with language and the limitations of language. So that's how I've understood it. But it sounds like you were using that in some other kind of sense, more experiential maybe.
And again, language is, it's hard for language ever to describe what's true.
Right.
Thus the finger pointing to the moon.
Right.
I think, bottom line in that regard is, I just think we do ourselves a disservice if we think there's a place to get to rather than just a process to be in.
I love that, Didi.